Training 27. This one's the gas extinguisher. I am excited about this one. I usually write 1 page of notes on these, and today I wrote 2 pages of notes on this one because I think it's so fun. So if you don't know me, I am Meredith Hawley. I'm a lawyer, power dynamics facilitator, and best-selling author. I help employees stop sexual harassment without quitting their jobs. And a lot of employees come to me and say, I think this is just gaslighting. All of us experience this one thing, and then now all of a sudden people are telling me that that's not what happened, are saying that I'm wrong about this. And this is especially true in discrimination situations. So often somebody who has a disadvantaged characteristic, like for example, in our society, being a woman is traditionally disadvantaged. Being a person of color is traditionally disadvantaged. So if you're a person of color and you're in a room, you're going to have one experience if you're in a room full of white people. And then often the white people will say, that didn't happen. That never happened. And you feel like, am I crazy? Is this like, I don't think I'm crazy. How is nobody else noticing this? And then you start to question yourself and doubt yourself. And so this is what we tend to call gaslighting. So I looked up the definition of gaslighting, and it says manipulate someone by psychological means to question their sanity. It's like, and there's the Gaslight movie, the Hitchcock movie, where it turns into all kinds of scary situation. So a lot of times what we do in these situations when we feel like we're experiencing gaslighting is we say, are they meaning to do this? Are they not meaning to do this? Are they doing this on purpose? Are they lying? Or are we having a different experience? And this is kind of the wrong question, because it's asking what the other person, the person who we think is gaslighting us, what their intent is. And if you're experiencing this situation, you kind of like, part of the problem is that we get more concerned about the other person's perspective of the situation than our own. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this. One of my clients had this experience where a colleague at work said in the presence of a number of witnesses, something like, I'm going to get back at her, I'm going to get her. And so they reported to her, and she felt very afraid about this. She felt like this was a threat, that he could potentially be violent to her. She was very afraid. She went to her bosses, and her bosses said, nah, it's not that big of a deal. I don't really think I think it's a misunderstanding. And then she started to think, am I overreacting to this? Is this real? And then she started doubting herself. But every time she saw this person who had made this statement, she would have a panic attack. She was terrified of him. If he came into her room, she would freeze and be terrified. But then partly she was freezing because she was thinking, am I wrong about this? Am I like totally misinterpreting this, and doubting herself, right? And so she had this experience of what happened and this intuition of what it meant. And her boss said he had a different experience and a different intuition of what it meant. And so she wanted to agree with him, right? And partly she wanted to agree with her boss because she thought, if I thought this didn't mean anything, then I could feel safe, right? If I agreed with him. But she didn't agree with him, and she didn't want to agree with him, right? I just had this experience today, even and this kind of happens with attorneys sometimes, where they will be very difficult in a case. So I have this experience right now where the opposing side has been very difficult the entire time, and they've known about this motion I was going to file for a while, for a few weeks. And they've opposed this motion, and I filed the motion, and then they asked for a very long extension related to the motion. And I said, normally I would give that extension, but given these circumstances, I don't feel like I can, and I feel like this is a very serious motion that we need to deal with right away. But the interesting thing that you see is they have one standard for themselves. They're allowed to oppose everything I do and make it the most difficult thing. And then when I oppose what they do, often what happens if it's somebody who's gaslighting, they get very personally offended if you engage in the same behavior that they're engaging in. And so when we're dealing with what I'm calling gas holes, you want to have a gas extinguisher. And so this is for when someone has too much gas that they need to let out in the world, and they're just making, like, having behaviors, having contrary behaviors, or contrary to you and to your experience and to your intuition, and you're thinking, should I agree with them? Am I right? Are they right? And you're sort of in this struggle, right? So this is called the gas extinguisher. So the first thing we want to look at is that what we're doing wrong when we're experiencing gaslighting. So the experience of gaslighting is the experience of when you're thinking, am I the crazy one? Am I crazy here? This is how people report feeling gaslighting. So what we're doing wrong in this situation is that we often, or usually what we're doing wrong, is we want them to change their behavior and be fair so that we can feel sane. We want them to, or we create this tension between, if they don't change their behavior, then I have to feel crazy. If they don't agree with me, then I have to feel crazy. And this makes it so hard. It gives them so much power over us, right? Because, like, it is very hard to change someone else's behavior. The easy thing is to take care of ourselves. But we're doing this for a reason that makes sense. We are taught, as we grow up, we're taught to get an A+ from the teacher. We're taught to listen and obey our parents. And that is very important when we're kids, right? It's important to listen to adults. It's important to sort of take our self-perspective from adults. But the problem is when we become adults, we apply that to supervisors and to other adults who do not have the ability to accurately give us our perceptions, right? So one example of this is if we're taking all of our thoughts about ourselves, all of our references of right and wrong and of what is normal from the people around us, like, this is sort of what created the Nazis, right? Is people being willing to go along with things that felt contrary to their intuition and to their morals because the group said it was normal, and because it's easier to normalize what the group says than to stand in our own integrity, right? And so what we want to think about when we're experiencing gaslighting, we want to think about the specific behaviors where we're experiencing dissonance, right? Where we're experiencing that our perspective is different than someone else's perspective. And then we want to listen to our intuition, right? And be willing to consider their perspective without it being a threat to ours. And the easiest way I've thought about this concept or heard this concept is if I was walking down the street and someone with a mental illness came up to me and said, "You have ugly purple hair," I wouldn't think, "Oh my God, what's going on? Do I have purple hair?" I wouldn't take my self-reference and make that question my perspective. And so then we want to look at the reason that we're invested in this other person's perspective over our perspective and question it, right? What if they're the person that just has the very mistaken perception of reality? And you get to have your intuition. A lot of times what people tell me is that if it's their boss, they have to agree with their boss or that they'll get fired. And the first thing I say about that is if often it's not a terrible thing to get fired. If you're showing up, doing your work, like showing up fully for your job, doing amazing work, and you get fired for being true to yourself and keeping yourself safe, that's probably a good thing. The other thing that I see is that often when we're not in our intuition, when we're not trusting ourselves and protecting ourselves, and when we are like treating our boss's opinion as more important than ourselves, often people end up quitting, which is really firing ourselves ahead of time, right? We quit because we feel like the environment is intolerable, but really what we can do is stay on our own side and be in our integrity. And this means that we still take the perspective of the other person and consider it as information for ourselves. We try it on. How does this perspective feel? And so this is like my client whose boss said, I don't think it's that big of a deal that your colleague said he's going to get you. I don't think that you're in danger, right? So she's trying this on, and it sounds like a nicer perspective, right? Like, what if she chose to believe she's not in danger and everything's fine? And the problem is that that feels like a lie to her. She does not want to choose that thought. And it feels like a threat to her safety to pretend that she's safe when she doesn't think she is. Because pretending to believe something that we don't is actually dangerous to us often. And so the shift we were able to make with her was not to believe all of a sudden that she was safe or that this coworker of hers was safe, but to believe that she was safe because she always keeps herself safe and she advocates for herself. Not to believe that this guy's not dangerous. That felt very dangerous to her, to pretend to believe somebody's not dangerous when she believed he was. Like when she had evidence that seemed important to her that he was, but to believe, like the shift that she made instead was to believe that she always keeps herself safe, even when there are dangerous people around her. So when she tried on her boss's thought of he's not a danger, it actually felt terrible, even though she was trying to force herself to believe it because that was what her boss believed. So usually if we're trying to believe someone else's thought, if we're feeling like we're being gaslighted, which I apparently, according to the internet, is the appropriate past tense of gaslighting. If we feel like we're being gaslighted, usually we're doing it because we want acceptance from the group, we want approval from a superior, or we think it might feel better than the thought we're choosing, right? And then you really want to question whether these are good reasons. If you are lying and not trusting your intuition to get acceptance from a group, they're not really accepting you. They're accepting a fake version of yourself that you think is more acceptable than who you really are. If you're lying to get approval from your supervisor, then you're disapproving who you really are ahead of time and creating this fake version for your supervisor to approve of. And this doesn't mean that the alternative is being rude or disrespectful, right? It's being in integrity and saying your honest truth, even when other people have a different opinion. So the bonkers view of things, the thing that's contrary to your view, isn't the only other option. This is like my client thought that the two options were she believes she's in danger, or she believes her boss's thought of this man's not dangerous. And there was an alternate thought of I'm safe because I keep myself safe, even though this guy is a danger, right? There's always 100 alternatives of what we can think, and we don't have to force ourselves to believe a thought that we don't believe. We don't have to force ourselves to believe somebody else's perspective that seems totally bonkers to us. So when you stop engaging with, if somebody is intentionally gaslighting, right? Sometimes people do this to get a rise out of people or to get attention. They like shift their perspectives, or they say one thing one day and another thing the next day, or they do something and then they accuse you of having done it. These are behaviors that people engage in. And then if you can be in your integrity and trust your belief, then you can stop engaging with them and trying to negotiate with their belief, right? Trying to convince them to have a new belief, or trying to convince yourself to have their belief, right? When you stop doing that and you just stay with yourself, with your intuition, and with what you believe, it's not rude. It's just having a solid yes or no. I'll consider it. That's not true. Yes, no, I'll consider it. Thank you for your opinion. Often when we stop engaging with people, if they're intentionally doing it, they will have something that's called an extinction burst of their past behavior. So an extinction burst is when they suddenly do this all the time. And the interesting thing about that to look forward to, if you are going to engage with this concept, is that it's good news if they do this all the time, because it's more practice for you to come back to your integrity. If they're having this behavior every 5 minutes, you get every 5 minutes to practice coming back to yourself, trusting your integrity, trying on their belief and seeing how it feels to you. This is totally worth doing to come back to yourself for your own growth and for your own moving forward. So it's hard to move forward in our careers, in our lives, if we're not trusting ourselves, if we're not showing up as who we are, and if we're trying to get approval from our bosses or trying to get acceptance from the group instead of giving that to ourselves. So this is how you do the gas extinguisher when you're experiencing gaslighting. You consider why you're trying on the other person's belief. You come back to your own integrity, to your own experience, and you have a clear yes or no. You try on their belief, and if it doesn't feel right to you, if it doesn't feel in integrity to you, you just say no to it. You say a clear no. And you let yourself, you give yourself the acceptance, you give yourself the approval that you might be hoping to get from the group, because it starts here with you. If you're not willing to give that to yourself, then likely it's going to be more difficult to get it from other people. When you start accepting yourself and you start approving of yourself, it teaches other people how to treat you. When your boss's view sounds like it might feel better than yours, try it on to see if it actually does feel better. There's no one who can gaslight you without you, unless you're giving them that power to do it, right? They can engage in gaslighting behavior, but it doesn't start feeling like gaslighting until you're questioning yourself and using their perspective to not accept yourself and not approve of yourself. This is sort of hard news, but it's also good news, because it means that you have a choice, and it means that you have power in all of these situations. And so that's what we always teach our clients. If you know anybody who's struggling at work with gaslighting experiences, we go into this in way more detail in our Power Dynamics Basics training, and we would love to talk to them. We'd love to help however we can. If you have questions about workplace culture, I have 3 more trainings that I'm doing in the next couple of days, and I would love to hear them and make sure I cover everything that you're thinking about or worried about. Thanks, you guys.